الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أما بعد. To continue in the study of Nukhbatul Fikr of Al-Hafidh ibn Hajr rahimahullah. Before we start, what is the most authentic book? And you know what the most authentic book is? The Quran. If someone asks you, what is the most authentic book? You reply with the Quran. If someone asks you, what is Asahul Kitab al-Mu'allafa? What is the most authentic book that is authored? Then you'll say Bukhari. That's something that is important to understand. If someone says, what's the most authentic book? You say the Quran. If someone asks you, what is the most authentic book that is authored? You'll say Bukhari. And then after that will be Muslim. That is something that is important for us to pay attention to. That when we say that Bukhari is the most authentic book, we mean the most authentic book authored. But the most authentic book is the book that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down upon His noble Messenger alayhi salatu wasalam, the Quran. Last week, we asked the brothers to do some homework. And some of the brothers, they sent me their homework regarding last week's class. And it was, what are the 6 books of hadith? The 6 books of hadith are as follows. They're called Ummahatul Sit. They are Al-Bukhari, Muslim, and we're going to mention them actually in the order of authenticity of the 6 books of hadith. So this is the most correct stance regarding the 6 books' authenticity. Number 1 is Bukhari. After is Muslim, Sahih Muslim. Number 3 is Sunan An-Nasa'i. When we mention An-Nasa'i here, we're talking about As-Sughra, because there's As-Sughra and Al-Kubra. So when we talk about Sunan An-Nasa'i, we're talking about As-Sughra, which is known as Al-Mujtaba. And they say this book is a book that he authored, or he summarized. He has a bigger, larger version of An-Nasa'i's Sunan. Then he summarized it, and he said that everything that he put in this book is what is authentic in his sight. Number 4 is Sunan Abi Dawud. Number 5 is Sunan At-Tirmidhi. And number 6 is Sunan Ibn Majah. These are the 6 books of hadith, and this is the order of their authenticity. So Al-Bukhari, Muslim, An-Nasa'i, Abu Dawud, At-Tirmidhi, and Ibn Majah. Now Ibn Majah, rahimahullah, his book was entered to be considered from the 6 books of hadith, first and foremost by Abu al-Fadl ibn Tahir al-Maqdisi. Abu al-Fadl ibn Tahir al-Maqdisi. And the people after that followed him in it. And that is, and it is also the weakest book of the 6 books of hadith. So the weakest of them is obviously, as you mentioned, Ibn Majah. Now Al-Mizzi, who is also the father-in-law of, anyone know who is the father-in-law of? Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir, the father-in-law of Ibn Kathir, Al-Mizzi. He said every narration that Ibn Majah singles out in narrating from the other 5 books is a hadith that is weak. But this statement, the scholars have criticized it, and they say it is not completely true. For Al-Hafidh ibn Hajr rahimahullah mentions that there's some hadith which he singled out, or many of them, which is singled out in reporting, and they're either sahih or hasan. There's just a benefit. I want to mention that some people, they go, when they talk about Ibn Majah's book, it's as if it is a book full of many weak narrations. No, there's authentic narration in it as well. And it's considered from the 6 books of hadith or the scholars of hadith. Other scholars, though, in the past, they used to deem Al-Muwatta of Imam Ibn Malik to be from the 6 books of hadith. Now, Al-Muwatta Ibn Malik was deemed as such by Razin al-Sarqusti. Razin al-Sarqusti. This scholar, or this Imam, was known from an area which is known as Zaragoza, Spain today. So he was from Spain area. Today is known as Zaragoza. Razin al-Sarqusti, he said that Al-Imam Malik's Muwatta is from the 6 books of hadith. And Ibn al-Athir and other than them followed him in that. They followed him in that. Now the reason why the latter scholars, they say Ibn Majah takes precedence over Muwatta of Imam Ibn Malik in the 6 books of hadith is because the narrations, which are additional narrations which are not found in the 5 books in Ibn Majah, are more in comparison to that which is found in Muwatta. Most of that which is in Muwatta is found in the 5 books of hadith. Most of it is found in the 5 books of hadith, whereas Ibn Majah has additions, many of them, that which are not found in the 5 books of hadith. So today, inshallah, we'll start next class now. The new class, he says, rahimahullah, last week we mentioned the 4 categories of an authentic narration. What are they? Sahih, lidhatihi. Sahih in of itself, then Sahih li ghayrihi, and then Hasan li dhati, and then Hasan li ghayrihi. And what are the 5 conditions of Sahih li dhatihi? The chain is connected. What else? They have adala, the reporters or the narrators have al-adala. Next one? Ad-dab, they have precision. Whether that precision is in al-hifz or al-kitaba. The next one? There's no irregulatory or illatun qadiha. There's no illah, hidden defect that harms the narration. And number 5 is no shadh. There is no irregularities that occur in the narration. So today he says now, if a narrator's dabt, his precision is not strong, whilst the condition of adala are met, then the narration is called hasan li dhatihi. So from this we understand, if the narrators are all trustworthy, for example, there's one narrator in that chain of narration where his ad-dabt, his precision is a bit lesser, this narration will become hasan li dhatihi. However, if it is reported through many chains, it can be classified at the level of sahih li ghayrihi. So from this you understand, sahih li ghayrihi means you have a hasan narration with many routes, and it gets raised up to be considered sahih li ghayrihi instead of hasan. Now I'm going to explain more inshallah. When these 2 descriptions, sahih and hasan, are combined, then it is due to the following reasons. Number 1, if it is because of some underlying issue or confusion about the transmitter of narration, which is a fard, then here they say that perhaps one scholar labels as sahih, another scholar labels as hasan. Otherwise, if there's many chains or 2 chains narration, then they're saying one chain is hasan and one chain is sahih. Now we're going to explain what he intended here. This definition of Ibn Hajr rahimahullah for hasan li dhatihi is the best of definitions. You'll find the books of hadith that they differed into a great extent to identify what is hasan li dhatihi, hasan in of itself. So the best definition is what Hafiz Ibn Hajr here mentions. Imam Al-Albani rahimahullah mentioned that this definition, although it is very brief and summarized, it is the most correct statement regarding narration, which is hasan li dhatihi, and that is a narration where it meets all of the conditions of sahih. It meets all the conditions, ittisalu sanad, al-adala, adam al-shudud, wa adam al-illah, except that the narrator's precision is lesser. Except that there's a narrator's precision that is lesser. One of the narrators or 2 of the narrators is lesser in precision. Now if this narration comes with different routes and different chains, then it is raised to sahih li ghayrihi, and that is because Hafiz Ibn Hajr mentions that weakness of precision is strengthened by these many routes. That weakness in precision that is present in hasan li ghayri, hasan li dhatihi, is strengthened by the many routes that have come regarding this narration. So it becomes sahih li ghayrihi. All of these are acceptable narrations. Sahih li dhati, sahih li ghayri, and hasan li dhati are acceptable narrations. But we're just trying to identify now where the scholars get these different terminologies from. It's important for us to understand how they get to this terminology or why they understood it this way. Now if you find an example in the Sunnah Tirmidhi, and he's famous for this, he'll mention after narration, you'll find often in his book, Hasan, Sahih. He may mention Hasan and Sahih for the same narration. The scholars have differed into great extent regarding what is intended when a scholar mentions Hasan and Sahih after a narration. From the best of those stances is Imam Muqbil's stance, that he says it is upon a student or a scholar to rule upon the narration himself. Because, for example, in At-Tirmidhi's book, in Sunnah At-Tirmidhi, he didn't identify what he intended. So you can't come later and say, but this is what At-Tirmidhi intended. He never clarified what he intended. So for that reason, Imam Muqbil says that a person rules upon the narration and judges upon it himself. Another stance that is extremely strong is the stance of Al-Hafiz Ibn Hajr rahimahullah. And that is what he mentions here. That if there is one single narration, then it could be said that they were doubtful whether it was Sahih or Hasan. They don't want to rule upon it wrongfully, so they labeled it Hasan and Sahih. So this narration, which is one route only, some scholars they say it's Hasan, some scholars they say it's Sahih. So he mentioned this, he has taraddud. He has doubt whether it is Hasan or whether it's Sahih. The second statement that they say, if there is more than one chain, then what they intended was that the one chain is Hasan and the second chain is Sahih. This is also from the strong stances regarding what Imam At-Tirmidhi and other scholars they intend when they mention Hasan, Sahih after narration. You'll find this often in Sunnah At-Tirmidhi. When you go read that book, you'll find that he says often Hasan Sahih. And then you'll say, example, Hasan Sahih Gharib. It is Hasan Sahih and is Gharib. What does Gharib mean? How many routes? One. So in that case, it will be the first stance, that what he's intending has taraddud. He has doubt whether he is Hasan or whether it's Sahih. But in other places, he won't mention Gharib. So in this case, there may be more than one chain. One is Hasan and one is Sahih. So it's important for us to understand these things as students of knowledge, because why? These are affairs that a student, when he goes into the books of hadith, he must understand these points. If you don't understand it correctly, then you're going to make mistakes and misunderstand what the author or the imam is trying to indicate to. Then he says, any additional wording to the text of hadith, meaning az-ziyada, by the narrators of these two types, meaning a narrator which is sahih or hasan, is acceptable as long as they do not contradict a more trustworthy narrator. If they contradict someone more trustworthy, what is that called? Shadh. Al-mukhalafat al-maqbuli man huwa awla min. Opposing someone who is more trustworthy than you. So here, if we have an addition, and there's no contradiction between it and the one who didn't narrate it, then in this case we accept it. So if we have a ziyada example, a narrator narrates a hadith one way, and another narrator comes and narrates a hadith a second way, and they don't contradict one another, then in this case is accepted. Ziyada, al-thiqah, the ziyada of a trusted narrator is acceptable. So long as there's no contradiction. So long as there's no contradiction between the different narrators. But if there is that which causes confusion and contradiction, then one must look at which one is stronger. Whether that is in sifat of the narrator, the attributes of the narrator, example, this one thiqah, and that one is only thiqah, then this thiqah, trustworthy, emphasized twice, takes more precedence than the one who's just trustworthy, for example. Or example, 14 narrators, as we mentioned before, the hadith of moving the finger in the prayer, 14 narrators mention the hadith one way, and Zaid ibn Qudama, although he's trustworthy, comes and narrates and says you have to move your finger. Which one you take? The one that 14 narrated one way, that you don't move your finger in the salah, and you leave off what Zaid ibn Qudama said, that you move your finger in the salah. For that reason, Imam Mukwa used to say, if the hadith is not shadh, there's no shadh hadith in the dunya. Just give an example that if there's that kind of contradiction and confusion, then you have to try to reconcile and find that which is more trustworthy and more authentic by looking at the narrators and their attributes, or looking at the number of narrations that have been reported a certain way. Then he says, so is that clear? Ziyadatul thiqah is accepted, so long as there's no contradiction. If there's a contradiction between the different trustworthy narrators, then we must look into the affair and see which one is more trustworthy, and also if their numbers are greater, who are related this way or related that way. And this is something that the scholars they differ often regarding. You'll find in the books of hadith, or the books of those who have authenticated hadith, one scholar will say this hadith is weak. And he'll say, why? Because this hadith opposes this narration, for example. Imam Mukul will say this narration opposes this one. And you find Imam Al-Albani come and say, but the narration is ziyadatu thiqah and is trustworthy. Just showing you that if you understand these points, you understand why the scholars are different in their grading of hadith. Where they came to that differing. This one says that the trustworthy narrator bringing an addition is acceptable. And this one says no, but if you oppose this one and this contradiction, it's not acceptable. So based upon different understanding of how the scholars grade it, you'll be able to understand why this scholar graded weak and this scholar graded authentic. So no one can come and say, but your scholars, they differ all the time. This one says it's weak, this one says it's authentic. Because he never understood why. He never truly understood where the difference comes from and what are the rules that they're applying to what they're grading the hadith by way of. Then he says, however, when a contradiction happens, then the following rules apply. If it contradicts with what is more preferred narration, either due to the strength of its narrators or other factors, then the preferred narration is called mahfudh. The preferred narration is called mahfudh. You find example Bulugh al-Maram. In some of the narration, he'll say this narration is mahfudh. What does that mean? Meaning this is the authentic narration when the scholars and the narrators have differed. This one is accepted and preserved. And the one that opposes is called ash-shadh. So you find that in Bulugh al-Maram. So it's important for a student to understand what is intended by these different terminologies. Mahfudh means that it is preserved and authentic, or that is the correct narration, and that which is shadh is an abnormal report. So you'll find these terminologies, example books like Bulugh al-Maram, that students should study and learn. In addition to the above, if the contradictory addition contains any weakness, then the preferred report is termed as al-ma'ruf. Meaning if there's a narration, there's some kind of weakness, that which is contradicting the weak narration is called ma'ruf. And that which a weak narrator opposes a trustworthy narrator is called what? We mentioned that last week. Munkar. If a weak narrator opposes a trustworthy narrator, it's called munkar. It is rejected, it is not accepted. It is a bad report and it's munkar, it is not accepted. So ma'ruf is that which is a reliable narrator relates in contradiction to that which a weak narrator reports. So ma'ruf is that which a reliable narrator relates in contradiction to that which a weak narrator reports. Whereas mahfudh and shadh, they're trustworthy narrators. They're not weak narrators reporting these narrations. But one is just more trustworthy than the other one. The one who is more trustworthy, his narration is mahfudh. And the one who is less trustworthy, his narration is shadh. It's irregular. Whereas when it comes to weak narrators reporting something, the one who is trustworthy, he related is ma'ruf. And the one who is weak, his relaying of it is munkar. These are terminologies that, as we mentioned, are important for us to understand. Every science you study, they have a terminology. Every science of knowledge you study, the scholars, they have a terminology that they go by way of. In order to understand the books of hadith, you have to understand his terminology. Example, as I mentioned, you go to Bulugh al-Maram, you say mahfudh. You don't know what that intended by what he's intending, you're going to get confused. So you should try your best to try to memorize these different terminologies. Al-Hafidh ibn Hajr then gives an example. He says, for example, it comes in At-Tirmidhi and An-Nasa'i and Ibn Majah. By route of Ibn Uyayna. What's his first name? Sufyan ibn Uyayna. From Amr ibn Dinar. From Amr ibn Dinar. From Awsajah. Awsajah, they say, was a slave of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anh. And the only one that related from him was Amr ibn Dinar. This is just a benefit. Awsajah narrates from Ibn Abbas that a man died in the time of the Prophet ﷺ and did not leave behind one to inherit except a slave he had freed. This is how At-Tirmidhi and An-Nasa'i and Ibn Majah related. So the chain is Ibn Uyayna, from Amr Dinar, from Awsajah, from Ibn Abbas. These are the four narrators. Ibn Jurayj, who is a trustworthy narrator, and others, they followed Ibn Uyayna in mentioning this narration from Awsajah, from Ibn Abbas. That's the point you have to remember now, that these narrators narrated this narration from Awsajah, from Ibn Abbas. But Hammad ibn Zayd, who is a great scholar of Islam, and he is a trustworthy narrator, he said, he related from Amr ibn Dinar, from Awsajah, and did not mention Ibn Abbas. So now, from what you've learned already, you have Ibn Uyayna and Ibn Jurayj mentioning that the report goes from Awsajah to Ibn Abbas. They're trustworthy. And you have now Hammad ibn Zayd comes and says that Awsajah and did not mention Ibn Abbas. Which one is accepted? And which one is rejected? The first, The one that goes to Ibn Abbas will be accepted in this case. And the one that doesn't go to Ibn Abbas is rejected. So what is the one that goes to Ibn Abbas called in this case? If they're all trusted narrators. Mahfudh. And the second one is called Shadh. So this is an example. For that reason, Abu Hatim al-Razi, he said, that which is al-mahfudh is a narration of Ibn Uyayna. Is a narration of Ibn Uyayna. Now Hammad ibn Zayd, he is the imam from the people of Adal and Dabt. But here, you still see Abu Hatim, he gave preference to that of Ibn Uyayna and Ibn Jurayj's narration due to the more routes that it was possessed. Due to the more routes. So that is a factor that shows whether narration will be considered mahfudh or shadh. Then he says, when a relatively unique report, fard and nisbi, is in agreement with other narrations, it is called al-mutabi'. Al-mutabi'ah. If a report is found whose matan resembles it, then it is called al-shawahid or shahid. And investigating various routes of transmission is called al-i'tibar. These three definitions we're going to mention now. Al-mutabi'ah, you'll find the scholars mentioned many times, walahu shahid. It has a witnessing report. وَلَهُ الْمُتَابِعَةِ. It has a report that follows it up. These are terms that are very common and well known amongst the scholars of hadith. Al-mutabi'ah means it is where a narrator narrates a narration, and another narrates the exact same narration from the same sahabi. So one narrator narrates a narration. We're going to give examples soon. A narrator comes and narrates a narration. And that which the original narrator narrated, someone else narrated as well, the same way, from the same companion. This is called al-mutabi'ah. Example. Al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, reported in his book Al-He He has a book called From Malik, so Ash-Shafi reported from Malik, who is his teacher, from Abdullah ibn Dinar, from Ibn Umar, that the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he said, the month is 29 days, so do not fast until you see the moon, and do not break your fast until you see the moon, and if it is covered from seeing it, then complete 30 days. This hadith. So here we have Ash-Shafi'i from Imam Malik, from Abdullah ibn Dinar, and from Ibn Umar. Some of the people of knowledge, they said that this narration, Ash-Shafi'i narrated himself from Malik. No one else narrated from Malik as well. But that is not correct. For it comes in Bukhari, from Abdullah ibn Maslama al-Qa'nabi, that he related from Malik the same exact narration. This would be called what? So we have one narration from his teacher. Another narrator now comes and narrates the same narration from his teacher, from the same Sahabi. It is called mutabi'ah. It is called mutabi'ah. So here, Ash-Shafi'i and also Abdullah ibn al-Maslam al-Ka'nabi reported this narration from Imam Malik. Both of them reported it and went all the way back to Ibn Umar. This is called al-mutabi'ah. So when you see a scholar say it has al-mutabi'ah, it has supporting routes and supporting narrations, this is what they intend. We're going to clarify a bit more later, inshallah. Now, al-mutabi'ah could be something which is tamma, which is complete, where it agrees with the original chain from the start, from the narrator himself. Or it could be qasira, partial, and that it joins with it and agrees with the original chain somewhere in the chain. What does that mean? This narration we mentioned from Abdullah, narrated from Imam Malik, the same as Shafi related from Imam Malik, this is called tamma. This is called tamma. Why? Because they basically come from the same Sahabi. They come from the same route, which is Imam Malik. Is that clear? They came from the same route. Both the students narrated from Imam Malik, and they went both to Ibn Umar. But there's a narration that comes from, by way of Asim ibn Muhammad, from his father Muhammad ibn Zayd, from his grandfather Abdullah ibn Umar. This would be considered qasira. It didn't come by way of Imam Malik. The same exact wording, both a different chain to Ibn Umar. This is a partial mutaba'ah. This is important. Why? Because by way of this, you identify the different routes. And by way of it, you strengthen the narration. You can strengthen narration by way of this. If it is mutaba'at, other scholars narrated the same narration from this Sahabi, you have now strengthened the narration. This is the benefit of al-mutaba'ah. That you basically use it to strengthen narration. Now obviously, this takes practice and time to try to identify it. But right now, we just mentioned the term al-mutaba'ah and what they intend by way of it. As for ash-shahid, it is where the narrators also narrate that which the original narrator reported in wording and meaning, but from a different companion. So al-mutaba'a means it goes back to the same companion. And ash-shahid means it goes to a different companion. So thus, for example, you find the one narration we just mentioned about the seeing the moon and not seeing the moon and fasting 29 or 30 days. It comes a shahid regarding that narration from the hadith of Ibn Abbas. So the same wording, but it comes from Ibn Abbas. That will be a shahid. That will be a witnessing report to witness for the narration of Ibn Umar. Nonetheless, both of these phrases could be used interchangeably. The scholars they mentioned, al-mutabi'a and al-shawahid, could be used interchangeably. وَلَا مُشَاهَ فِي الْإِصْطِلَاحِ. There's no hardship in different using terms. So if someone says al-mutabi'a from a different companion or shahid from the same companion, there's no problem with that. As Imam Muqr mentioned, that there's no problem with that. And similarly, Al-Hafiz ibn Hajr mentioned al-nuzha, that they could be used interchangeably. And it should be something that you should not go too strict in regards to. And the affair is easy. So nonetheless, what you now have to understand, al-mutab and al-shahid basically means that you have supporting routes to support the narration. Whether it's from the same companion or from a different companion. If you have a supporting route, it's called al-mutab or shahid. So that for that reason, when you find the scholars, they say, this narration so-and-so said is weak, balahu shahid. It has a witnessing report that supports it. That is what they intend. That it comes from a different route, whether from the same companion or different companion, that supports the narration. Al-i'tibar basically means the research you're going to do. Al-i'tibar is the research you are doing to compile the different routes. That's called al-i'tibar. Al-i'tibar is basically you gather the different chains of narration of the hadith reported by a narrator to see if others also reported it or not. Imam Muqbil mentioned that research you do to gather narrations and to see the different reports, that's called al-i'tibar. So you looking for shawahid and you're looking for mutabi'at, is called al-i'tibar. is called al-i'tibar. Now the scholars, they're known for doing this, and this is from the best of ways, gathering narrations and reports. It is from the most beneficial ways of understanding al-ilal, understanding hidden defects in narrations. The only way you can truly understand hidden defects in narrations is by way of you gathering all the different routes, the different chains, and the different wordings of the hadith, and you'll be able to identify where the mistake occurred and where it didn't occur. For that reason, only certain scholars were well known for al-ilal. It's not for everyone to do, because it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of patience, and it also takes a lot of memorization. For that reason, Abu Hatim al-Razi, he used to say, this is something that Allah blessed me with. I don't know how I know this stuff, but Allah blessed me with it. So some of them say it's like ilham. It's like Allah blessing you with it in certain places, because it's not something which is easy to always remember the different routes, the different wordings. For that reason, the scholars of al-ilal, they're very few, like Ali al-Madini, Abu Hatim al-Razi, Imam Ahmed, and in our time, Imam Muqil and Imam al-Albani rahimahullah. These scholars, they were able to identify and gather the different routes and the different chains of narration, and then rule upon different narrations where the weakness occurred and how it occurred, or how the specific route is not authentic and that other route is authentic. So we'll stop with this much, inshallah. What is sought from the brothers to memorize the different terminologies, al-mutabi' and al-shawahid, and also to memorize what we mentioned about Hasan al-Sahih, Hasan al-Lidati, and what they intended by Hasan al-Sahih. Now the homework for next week is, where did this taqseem, this categorization of Sahih and Hasan al-Da'if come from? The homework for next week is for you to try to research where this categorization of Hasan or Sahih, Hasan and Da'if came from. Because the scholars in the past, they knew Sahih and Da'if, and Hasan was included in Sahih. But this categorization came later on, where they categorized it to Sahih, Hasan and Da'if. And your homework is to try to identify where that categorization came from and who became famous for it. So we'll stop with this much. If there's any quick questions, we'll take now. If not, continue next week, inshallah.